The phone rang at 2 in the morning, shrill and desperate in the darkness of my bedroom. By the time I fumbled for it, my hands already shaking from more than just being startled awake, I knew something was terribly wrong. The voice on the other end was my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, speaking in rapid, panicked sentences about flashing lights and paramedics and how she'd seen them carry me out on a stretcher. Except I was standing right there in my nightgown, perfectly fine, staring out my window at the ambulance parked in front of my house. That's when I realized what my children had done and why they'd spent the last 6 months telling me they were too busy to visit their dying mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Martinez, and at 74, I thought I knew everything there was to know about disappointment. I'd raised 3 children as a single mother after their father walked out when the youngest was barely 2. I'd worked double shifts at the textile factory for 30 years, came home to help with homework, attended every school play and soccer game, and somehow managed to put all 3 through college. Now, in what should have been my golden years, I was learning that the people I'd sacrificed everything for had become strangers who couldn't find an hour in their schedules to visit their mother. It had started innocently enough 6 months ago. My oldest, Patricia, lived just 20 minutes away in this suburban development where all the houses looked exactly the same and the lawns were maintained by landscaping crews. She used to come by every Sunday with her husband, Derek, and their twin boys, ages 12. We have dinner, the boys would complain about my cooking while secretly going back for seconds, and Patricia would update me on her latest promotion at the marketing firm. Then suddenly, the visit stopped. "Mom, I'm swamped at work," she'd say when I called. "This new campaign is consuming my life. Maybe next weekend." Next weekend would come and go with the same excuse. The campaign had apparently been consuming her life for half a year now. My middle child, Robert, had moved to Seattle for his tech job 2 years ago. He'd always been the most distant of my children, brilliant with computers but struggling with human connections. His calls had dwindled from weekly to monthly to barely at all. When I did manage to reach him, he sounded distracted, always typing in the background. "Mom, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of debugging some critical code. You understand, right?" But it was my youngest, Maria, who broke my heart the most. She lived downtown in one of those trendy lofts, working as a photographer for the local newspaper. She'd always been my baby, the one who'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms long past the age when her siblings had outgrown such needs. She'd been my companion through everything, from grocery shopping to old movie marathons. Then, like her siblings, she became too busy. "Mama, I know it's been forever, but I'm shooting 3 weddings this weekend, and next week I have that exhibition opening. You know how important this is for my career, right? Rain check." The rain checks piled up like unpaid bills, and I found myself rattling around in the same house where I'd raised them, surrounded by photos of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, wondering where I'd gone wrong. The silence was deafening. Some evenings I'd call just to hear their voicemails, just to remember what their voices sounded like when they used to say, "I love you," instead of, "I'm busy." Mrs. Chan from next door had become my closest companion by default. She was 82, a widow like me, though her children visited from Portland every month without fail. We'd sit on my front porch in the evenings, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes and sharing stories about the olden days when families actually spent time together. She never said anything about my children's absence, but I could see the pity in her eyes when yet another Sunday passed without visitors. The loneliness was eating me alive, but it was the mysterious phone calls that really started to worry me. They'd begun about a month ago, always during the day when the house felt emptiest. A man's voice, professional but urgent, asking for Eleanor Martinez, asking about my medical history, my insurance information, my emergency contacts. When I'd ask who was calling and why they needed this information, the line would go dead. "Probably scammers," Mrs. Chen had suggested when I mentioned it. "They target elderly people, always trying to steal Medicare information." But something about the calls felt different, more official somehow. The voices were too professional, too knowledgeable about my personal details for typical scammers. Then there were the medical bills that started arriving. Bills for doctor visits I'd never made, specialists I'd never seen, tests I'd never taken. When I called the billing departments, they assured me that Eleanor Martinez had indeed been seen on the dates in question. When I insisted it wasn't me, they'd put me on hold, speak to supervisors, and eventually tell me they'd look into the discrepancy. I'd tried to discuss these strange occurrences with my children during our increasingly rare phone conversations, but they seemed distracted, dismissive. "Mom, you probably just forgot about the appointments," Patricia had said. "At your age, memory issues are completely normal. Maybe you should see someone about that." Robert had been even less helpful. "Just dispute the charges with your insurance, Mom. These billing errors happen all the time. I really can't walk you through basic adulting right now."
Maria, my sweet Maria, who used to hang on my every word, had barely listened at all. "Mama, I'm sure it's nothing serious. Can we talk about this later? I'm setting up for a shoot, and the lighting is perfect right now." So I'd handled it alone, like I'd been handling everything else. I'd made lists, kept detailed records, called insurance companies and medical offices until I was blue in the face. But the bills kept coming, the mystery calls continued, and the feeling that something was very wrong grew stronger each day. That's when I started noticing the car, a dark blue sedan that would park across the street from my house, always with someone sitting inside. At first, I thought it might be someone visiting the neighbors, but it appeared too regularly, always positioned with a clear view of my front door. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen, she confirmed she'd seen it too. "Very strange," she'd said, adjusting her glasses to peer across the street. "Same car, different times a day. Yesterday I saw someone taking pictures." Taking pictures of what? I'd wondered, but I was afraid to ask. The paranoia was settling in like fog, making everything seem sinister and uncertain. Sleep became elusive. Every sound outside made me jump. The house I'd loved for 40 years was starting to feel like a prison. 2 weeks ago, things escalated. I'd been coming home from the grocery store when I noticed my front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd locked it before leaving, the way I'd been locking everything obsessively since the strange calls began. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed, but there was a feeling in the air, a sense that someone had been there. My jewelry box was in exactly the same spot, my purse untouched on the kitchen counter, but something felt wrong. It wasn't until that evening that I realized what it was. My medication organizer, the plastic container with 7 days' worth of compartments that I filled every Sunday night, was sitting in a slightly different position on my bathroom counter. The pills inside looked the same, but the container had definitely been moved. When I called the police, they took a report, but seemed skeptical. Nothing was stolen, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had actually been inside. "Sometimes when we're stressed or anxious, we notice things differently," the young officer had explained kindly. "Memory can play tricks on us, especially as we get older. Maybe you moved it yourself and forgot." Even the police thought I was a confused old lady. The isolation was complete now. My children were too busy to listen to my concerns. The authorities dismissed my worries as senior confusion, and I was left alone with the growing certainty that something was happening to me, something I couldn't quite understand. Last Thursday, Mrs. Chan had knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Eleanor, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you feeling all right? You haven't been outside in 3 days, and I saw lights on in your house all night long." I realized then how bad it had gotten. I'd been afraid to leave the house, afraid to sleep, afraid to take my medications in case someone had tampered with them. The woman who'd once managed a household of 3 children and worked full-time was now scared of her own shadow. "I'm fine," I'd lied, because what else could I say? That I thought someone was watching me, entering my house, manipulating my medical care, while my own children couldn't be bothered to return my phone calls?
It sounded crazy even to me. But Mrs. Chen knew better. She'd lived long enough to recognize the signs of someone in distress. You know, Eleanor, my daughter is driving up from Portland this weekend. Why don't you call one of your children? Sometimes families need to come together during difficult times. I tried. God knows I tried. I called Patricia first, getting her voicemail, as usual. Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom. I know you're busy, but I really need to talk to someone. Could you call me back when you get a chance? It's important. She'd texted me back 3 hours later. Everything okay? Can't talk now, but we'll try to call this weekend. Super slammed with work stuff. Robert had been even more distant. When I finally reached him, he sounded irritated at the interruption. Mom, I'm in meetings all day.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Can you just tell me quickly what's wrong? How do you quickly explain that your world is falling apart, that you feel like a stranger in your own life, that the loneliness is so profound it physically hurts? I just miss you kids, I'd said instead. I was hoping someone could visit soon. Mom, you know I'm in Seattle. I can't just drop everything and fly across the country because you're feeling lonely. Maybe you should look into some senior activities, make some new friends. Maria had been my last hope. She'd always been the most empathetic of my children, the one who'd understood feelings better than facts. But when I reached her, she sounded rushed and distracted. Mama, I'm literally walking into the most important meeting of my career right now. Can this wait? If it's an emergency, call 911. Otherwise, I'll try to call you next week. Next week. Always next week, next month, next whenever it was convenient for their busy, important lives. I hung up the phone and sat in my empty house, surrounded by 40 years of memories and the growing certainty that something terrible was about to happen. That was yesterday. Today, Mrs. Chen called at 2 a.m. to tell me she'd watched paramedics carry me out of my house on a stretcher, load me into an ambulance, and drive away with sirens wailing. Except I was standing right there, perfectly fine, watching the same ambulance she was describing. As I stood at my bedroom window, phone still in my hand, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the houses in my quiet neighborhood, I finally understood what had been happening. Someone had been living my life, using my identity, seeing doctors in my name, creating a medical history I knew nothing about. And tonight, someone who looked enough like me to fool the neighbors had been taken away in an ambulance, playing out the final act of an elaborate deception. The question now was who had done this to me and why? But more importantly, what was going to happen when my children received the call they'd been too busy to take from me? What would they do when they got word that their mother, the woman they'd been avoiding for months, had been rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night? I was about to find out just how busy they really were when they thought they might be losing me forever. The ambulance was pulling away now, disappearing into the night with its precious cargo, whoever that was. My phone was already ringing again, and this time I recognized the number. It was Patricia, probably getting the call from the hospital, probably experiencing the first real panic she'd felt in months. I let it ring, watching the taillights of the ambulance fade into the distance, and wondered if my children would finally have time for me now that they thought I was dying. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 6 months dying of loneliness while they were too busy to notice, and now someone else was potentially dying in my place while they rushed to a hospital to see a woman who wasn't really me. The phone kept ringing. Patricia was calling back immediately, which she hadn't done for any of my calls in recent memory. Then Robert's number flashed on the screen. Then Maria's. All 3 of my children, suddenly very available, suddenly very concerned, suddenly not too busy to talk to their mother. I set the phone aside and made myself a cup of tea, my hands steadier than they'd been in weeks. Whatever was happening, whoever had orchestrated this elaborate charade, they'd accomplished one thing they probably hadn't intended. They'd shown me exactly where I stood with my own children, and they'd given me the clarity I needed to figure out what came next. The ambulance was gone, but the questions it left behind were just beginning.
As I settled into my favorite chair with my tea, listening to my phone ring with the desperate calls of children who suddenly had time for their mother, I realized this was only the beginning of a very long night. Tomorrow, there would be explanations to give, truths to uncover, and a mystery to solve. But tonight, for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I was curious. And I was finally ready to find out who had been living my life while I'd been dying from neglect. The first call came at 2:17 a.m. Patricia's voice was higher than I'd heard it in years, cracking with panic in a way that reminded me of when she was 7 and had nightmares about monsters under her bed. "Mom? Oh my God, Mom, are you there? The hospital just called and said you were brought in unconscious. I'm getting dressed right now. Derek's starting the car. We're coming right now." I listened to my daughter's frantic breathing through the phone. This woman who hadn't had time for a simple conversation in 6 months, now ready to drive across town at 2 in the morning. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth. "Patricia, I'm fine. I'm standing in my kitchen making tea." Silence. Then confusion bleeding through the panic. "What? That's impossible. Memorial Hospital called me 20 minutes ago."
They said you were brought in by ambulance, unresponsive, and that I was listed as your emergency contact. They said you were in critical condition. Well, as you can hear, I'm very much conscious and responsive. But Mom, that doesn't make sense. They had all your information, your address, your insurance card, your medical history. They knew about your diabetes medication and your blood pressure pills. How would they know all that if it wasn't really you? That stopped me cold. My diabetes medication. I'd been diagnosed just last year, and the only people who knew about it were my children and my primary care physician, Dr. Hendricks. The hospital would have had to have detailed medical records to know about medication that specific. Before I could process this fully, my phone buzzed with another call. "Robert, Mom, what the hell is going on? I just got off the phone with some doctor at Memorial Hospital who says you've been admitted with a heart attack. I'm booking the first flight out of Seattle right now." My son's voice, usually so controlled and measured, was shaking. I could hear him typing frantically in the background, probably pulling up airline websites while we talked. "Robert, slow down. I'm perfectly fine. I'm at home. That's not possible. I spoke to Dr. Williams in the ER. He said you were brought in unconscious and they're running cardiac tests. He said your condition was serious and that family should get there immediately." Dr. Williams. I'd never heard that name before, but he apparently knew enough about my medical condition to convince my son that I was dying. The pieces of this puzzle were getting more disturbing by the minute. My phone rang again before I could respond to Robert. Maria's number flashed on the screen. "Mama? Mama, please tell me you're okay. I just got the scariest phone call of my life. Some nurse said you collapsed at home and they're not sure if you're going to make it through the night." 3 children who hadn't made time for me in months, all calling within minutes of each other, all convinced their mother was dying in a hospital room while I stood in my own kitchen. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to orchestrate this deception, and they'd done it with information that should have been impossible to obtain. "Listen to me, all of you," I said, conferencing the calls together. "I need you to calm down and listen carefully. I am at home. I am fine. And whoever called you is not telling the truth." "Mom, that's crazy," Patricia interjected. "Why would the hospital lie about something like this? They had all your personal information." "That's exactly what I intend to find out. But right now, I need you all to cancel whatever travel arrangements you're making and meet me at Memorial Hospital in 1 hour. "But if you're fine, why do we need to go to the hospital?" Robert asked. "Because someone is in that hospital room pretending to be me, and I want to find out who it is and why they're doing it." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. For the first time in months, I had my children's complete attention, but it had taken a medical emergency that wasn't even real to get it. "This is insane," Maria whispered. "People don't just pretend to be other people in hospitals. That's not how the world works. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. But 6 months ago, I also thought my children would make time to visit their mother occasionally. I've learned that the world doesn't always work the way we think it should." The guilt in that statement hung heavy between us. But I didn't have time for family therapy right now. Someone was playing an elaborate game with my life, and they'd done it with information that should have been impossible to obtain. Listen to me, all of you, I said, conferencing the calls together. I need you to calm down and listen carefully. I am at home. I am fine, and whoever called you is not telling the truth. Mom, that's crazy, Patricia interjected. Why would the hospital lie about something like this? They had all your personal information. That's exactly what I intend to find out. But right now, I need you all to cancel whatever travel arrangements you're making and meet me at the hospital lobby at 3:30. But if you're fine, why do we need to go to the hospital? Robert asked. Because someone is in that hospital room pretending to be me, and I want to find out who it is and why they're doing it. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. For the first time in months, I had my children's complete attention, but it had taken a medical emergency that wasn't even real to get it. This is insane, Maria whispered. People don't just pretend to be other people in hospitals. That's not how the world works. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. But 6 months ago, I also thought my children would make time to visit their mother occasionally. I've learned that the world doesn't always work the way we think it should.
The guilt in that statement hung heavy between us, but I didn't have time for family therapy right now. Someone was playing an elaborate game with my life, and they'd involved my children as unwitting participants. Meet me in the hospital lobby at 3:30, I said. And don't mention to anyone that you've spoken to me. I want to see how far this charade goes. I hung up and stood in my quiet kitchen, processing what had just happened. For 6 months, my children had been too busy to return phone calls, too occupied with their important lives to spare an afternoon for their aging mother.
But one call from a hospital, one suggestion that they might lose me forever, and suddenly they were ready to drop everything. Patricia was getting dressed and driving across town in the middle of the night. Robert was booking emergency flights from Seattle. Maria was probably already in her car, racing through empty streets to get to my bedside. The mother they'd been too busy to visit when she was healthy and lonely became their top priority the moment they thought she was sick and dying. I went upstairs and got dressed properly, choosing a simple navy dress and comfortable shoes. If I was going to confront whoever was impersonating me, I wanted to look composed and dignified. I also wanted to look nothing like someone who'd just been brought to the hospital unconscious. The drive to Memorial Hospital took 15 minutes through the quiet pre-dawn streets. I'd made this same drive countless times over the years, visiting friends who'd had surgeries, attending the births of grandchildren I was apparently too embarrassing to acknowledge anymore, accompanying my late husband during his final illness. But I'd never driven there to confront someone who was pretending to be me. The hospital lobby at 3:15 a.m. was nearly empty, except for a security guard dozing behind the information desk and a janitor mopping floors in slow, methodical strokes. I took a seat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs and waited for my children to arrive. Patricia was first, rushing through the automatic doors with her hair still messy from sleep and her usually perfect makeup completely absent. She looked around frantically until she spotted me, then stopped dead in her tracks. Mom, oh my God, you really are fine. She ran over and grabbed my hands, her own trembling slightly. I don't understand what's happening. Neither do I, but we're going to find out. Robert arrived 10 minutes later, looking haggard and confused. He'd apparently caught a red-eye flight that had just landed because he was carrying a small overnight bag and looked like he'd been traveling for hours. I can't believe I flew across the country for this, he said, but his relief was obvious. Do you have any idea how much a last-minute plane ticket costs? About the same as a phone call to your mother once a week, I replied dryly. Maria burst through the doors just as the clock hit 3:30, her camera bag slung across her shoulder and her car keys still in her hand. She looked like she'd thrown on the first clothes she could find and run out the door. Mama, I was so scared, she said, wrapping me in a hug that reminded me of the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during storms. I thought I was going to lose you. You've been losing me for months, I said gently. You just didn't notice until someone told you I was dying. The weight of that truth settled over all three of them, but this wasn't the time for family reconciliation. We had a mystery to solve. Now, I said, standing up and straightening my dress, let's go find out who's been living my life. We approached the information desk where the security guard was now awake and alert. I showed him my driver's license and explained that I'd been told I was a patient here, but that I was obviously not in need of medical care. The guard looked confused, checked his computer, and confirmed that Eleanor Martinez had indeed been brought in by ambulance earlier that morning and was currently in room 347, listed in serious condition. "But that's impossible," Patricia said, pointing at me. "This is Eleanor Martinez, and she's standing right here." The security guard looked back and forth between his computer screen and my face, clearly out of his depth. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor," he said. While we waited, I noticed a familiar figure walking through the lobby. Dr. Hendricks, my primary care physician, looking tired and concerned as he headed toward the elevators. He'd apparently been called in during the night to treat his patient, not knowing that his patient was currently standing in the lobby rather than lying unconscious upstairs. "Dr. Hendricks," I called out. He turned, saw me, and his face went completely white. For a moment, I thought he might faint. "Eleanor, what are you doing here? How are you here? I just came from your room upstairs, and the woman they brought in looks exactly like you, but she's been unconscious since admission." "That's what we're trying to figure out," I said. "Can you take us up to see this person who's supposed to be me?" Dr. Hendricks looked nervously, clearly unsure about the protocol for a situation that had never been covered in medical school. "This is highly irregular, but given the circumstances, I think we need to sort this out immediately." He led us to the elevator, all of us crowded into the small space in uncomfortable silence. My children kept staring at me like they were afraid I might disappear if they looked away. Dr. Hendricks kept checking his watch and shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a strange dream. Room 347 was in the cardiac unit, which explained why my children had been told I'd had a heart attack. Through the window in the door, I could see a figure lying in the hospital bed, connected to various monitors and machines. The person was roughly my size and build, with gray hair similar to mine, but I couldn't see the face clearly from this angle. "The resemblance is remarkable," Hendricks said quietly. "When they brought her in, I was convinced it was you. Same height, same hair color, same general build. Even the medical bracelet she was wearing had your information on it." A medical bracelet I'd never owned, containing information about conditions I'd never discussed with anyone except Dr. Hendricks and my children. We entered the room quietly, not wanting to wake the patient if she was sleeping naturally, but as I got closer to the bed, I realized why the resemblance had been so convincing from a distance. The woman lying there wasn't just similar to me, she was wearing a wig that matched my hair color exactly. Her makeup had been applied to make her features look more like mine. Even her jewelry, what little I could see, looked like pieces from my collection. But it was her hands that gave it away. The woman in the bed had smooth, manicured hands without the age spots and calluses that marked my own. These were the hands of someone much younger, someone who'd never worked in a textile factory for 30 years or spent decades doing housework without gloves. "This isn't just a coincidence," I said slowly, studying the sleeping figure. "Someone planned this very carefully." Robert was examining the medical chart at the foot of the bed. "According to this, you've been seeing doctors regularly for months. Cardiac specialists, neurologists, even an oncologist. Mom, when was the last time you actually saw Dr. Hendricks?" I thought about it. "My annual checkup in January. I haven't had any health problems that required additional visits." Dr. Hendricks looked puzzled. "That's strange, because my records show that you've been in to see me 6 times since January. We've discussed your increasing fatigue, your concerns about memory loss, your family history of heart disease." The room went quiet, except for the steady beeping of the monitors. Someone had been impersonating me for months, building a medical history that painted a picture of a woman in declining health. They'd used my insurance, my personal information, and somehow obtained details about my family that should have been private. "Doctor," Patricia said slowly, "during these visits that weren't actually with my mother, what kind of information did this person provide about her family?" Dr. Hendricks consulted his notes. "She spoke often about feeling isolated, about her children being too busy to visit. She seemed quite depressed about the lack of family support. She mentioned that she was worried about what would happen to her grandson Tommy if something happened to her." "I don't have a grandson named Tommy."
I don't have any grandchildren at all, something that had been a source of quiet sadness for years as my children focused on their careers instead of starting families. She was also very concerned about her financial situation, Dr. Hendricks continued. She mentioned several times that she was worried about being able to afford long-term care if her health continued to decline. Maria grabbed my arm. Mama, how would someone know enough about our family dynamics to impersonate you convincingly? They knew that we hadn't been visiting. They knew about your medical conditions. They even knew details about your insurance and finances. The answer was starting to form in my mind, but it was so unthinkable that I didn't want to voice it yet. Someone with access to my personal information, my medical records, my family dynamics, someone who would benefit financially from my declining health or death, someone who knew that my children were too busy to visit regularly so they wouldn't notice if my mother's behavior or conditions seemed different during brief phone calls. We need to see who's been paying for these medical visits, and we need to find out who this woman really is. As if summoned by my words, the woman in the bed stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, disoriented by the medications and the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she saw all of us standing around her bed, and her expression changed to one of pure terror. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from whatever had rendered her unconscious. "I just needed the money. I didn't know it would go this far." Patricia stepped forward. "Who are you, and who paid you to pretend to be our mother?" The woman struggled to sit up, the hospital gown slipping off one shoulder. She was probably in her 50s, with features that were naturally similar enough to me that minimal makeup and the right wig could create a convincing resemblance, at least to medical professionals who'd never met me before. "My name is Janet," she said slowly. "Janet Morrison."
I was hired to play your mother by someone who said it was for insurance purposes. They said it was legal, that it was just to help establish a medical history for someone who'd been avoiding doctors. Hired by whom? Robert demanded. Janet looked around the room nervously, clearly weighing her options. I can't tell you that. They said if I ever revealed who hired me, there would be consequences. The consequences for identity theft and insurance fraud are going to be a lot worse than whatever they threatened you with, I said firmly. This has gone far beyond establishing a medical history. You've been living my life, using my insurance, and tonight my children thought I was dying because of this charade. Janet started crying, not the manipulative tears of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the genuine sobs of someone who'd gotten in over their head. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I needed the money for my own medical bills, and they said it would just be a few doctor visits. They said no one would get hurt. But someone did get hurt, Maria said quietly. Our family has been destroyed by this. Our mother has been isolated and alone while we thought she was getting medical care she didn't need. Who hired you? Dr. Hendricks asked, his professional demeanor barely concealing his anger at being deceived. I need to know how my medical practice was compromised. Janet wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It was someone who claimed to work for an insurance company. They said they were investigating potential fraud and needed to establish whether Eleanor Martinez was actually as sick as she claimed to be. They said they suspected she was faking illnesses to collect benefits. That made no sense. I hadn't filed any insurance claims, hadn't been seeing doctors, hadn't been collecting any benefits for illnesses I didn't have. Unless someone else had been filing claims in my name, using Janet's visits to establish a pattern of declining health that would justify expensive treatments or disability payments. What was this person's name? I asked. They said their name was David Chen, but I don't think that was real. All our communications were through email and anonymous phone calls. The payments came through money transfers that couldn't be traced back to any specific account. David Chen. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor, who'd become my closest companion during these months of isolation. Mrs. Chen, who knew my schedule, who had access to my mail when I was out, who knew about my children's absence and my loneliness. Mrs. Chen, whose own children visited regularly from Portland, providing a stark contrast to my own family situation. But it couldn't be her. She was 82 years old, a sweet widow who shared tea and gossip with me on the front porch. She was the one who'd called me tonight to tell me about the ambulance.
She was the one who'd been encouraging me to reconnect with my children. Or maybe that was exactly why it made perfect sense. Dr. Hendricks, I said slowly, I need to see all the medical records for the visits Janet made pretending to be me, and I need to see any insurance claims that have been filed in my name over the past 6 months. Mrs. Martinez, those are private medical records. I can't just hand them over without proper authorization. I am Eleanor Martinez, I said firmly. Those are my records, even if I wasn't the one who created them. And I suspect when you examine them closely, you're going to find evidence of insurance fraud on a scale much larger than simple identity theft. As Dr. Hendricks retrieved the files, I looked around at my children, all 3 of them present and accounted for the first time in months. It had taken a fake medical emergency to get them here, but now that they were here, we were going to solve this mystery together, and we were going to have a long overdue conversation about what family really means and what happens when you become too busy for the people who need you most. Dr. Hendricks returned 20 minutes later with a thick folder and a grim expression that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. He set the files down on the small table by the window and looked at each of us in turn, clearly struggling how to explain what he'd discovered. Eleanor, in the past 6 months, someone using your identity has accumulated over $80,000 in medical bills. The insurance claims show treatment for advanced cardiac disease, early-stage dementia, and a suspicious growth that required multiple expensive scans and consultations with specialists. I felt the blood drain from my face. $80,000.
No wonder someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to create this deception. This wasn't just about collecting small disability payments or prescription drug benefits. This was about setting up a major insurance fraud scheme that could net hundreds of thousands of dollars. But here's what's even more disturbing, Dr. Hendricks continued, opening the folder and pulling out several documents. The medical power of attorney forms and advance directives in this file aren't signed by you. They're signed by someone claiming to be your neighbor and closest friend, listed as your emergency contact and healthcare proxy. He handed me a document that made my hands shake as I read it. The signature at the bottom was a passable imitation of my own handwriting, but it authorized someone named Helen Chen to make all medical decisions on my behalf in case of incapacitation. The document was dated 3 months ago, allegedly signed during a visit I'd never made to a lawyer's office I'd never heard of. Helen Chen? Patricia asked, looking over my shoulder at the paperwork. Mom, isn't your neighbor Mrs. Chen, the elderly lady you've been spending time with? The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. Mrs. Chen, who knew my daily routine better than anyone, who had encouraged me to share details about my family, my finances, my medical history during our long conversations on the front porch, who had expressed such sympathy about my children's absence, gathering information about our family dynamics that could be used to make Janet's impersonation more convincing. There's more, Dr. Hendricks said quietly. According to these records, Eleanor Martinez has been declining rapidly. The notes indicate increasing confusion, memory loss, and an inability to manage her own affairs. There are recommendations for immediate placement in a long-term care facility, with all medical and financial decisions to be made by her designated health care proxy. Robert was paging through the insurance claims with the focused intensity he usually reserved for debugging code. Mom, look at this. There are charges for ambulance services, emergency room visits, specialist consultations, and expensive diagnostic procedures going back months. Someone has been systematically billing your insurance company for treatments that never happened. Not just treatments that never happened, Maria added, examining another set of documents. Look at these psychiatric evaluations. According to this, you've been diagnosed with severe depression and early dementia. There are recommendations for medication and supervised care. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Someone had created an entire alternate medical history for me, one that painted a picture of a woman rapidly losing her mental faculties and needing immediate intervention. With my children too busy to visit regularly,
There would have been no one to contradict this fabricated decline. "Janet," I said, turning back to the woman in the hospital bed who had been listening to our conversation with growing horror. "How long were you supposed to continue this charade?" Janet looked like she wanted to disappear into the hospital mattress. "They said it would be finished soon, that there was one final procedure scheduled, and after that I'd be done." "What kind of final procedure?" "I don't know exactly. They said it was routine surgery, but that the recovery would be complicated. They said I'd be staying in the hospital for several weeks, maybe longer." Dr. Hendricks and I exchanged alarmed looks. A complicated surgical procedure with an extended hospital stay performed on someone impersonating me while I remained unaware at home? The potential for medical malpractice lawsuits, insurance payouts, and wrongful death settlements was enormous. "When was this surgery supposed to take place?" Dr. Hendricks asked. "Tomorrow morning. They said the paperwork was already completed and the surgical team had been briefed. I was supposed to be unconscious from tonight until after the procedure, so I wouldn't be able to talk to anyone or answer questions that might expose the deception." The timing was perfect from a criminal standpoint. With me supposedly unconscious and unable to communicate, Mrs. Chen, as my healthcare proxy, would have the authority to make all decisions about my treatment. She could authorize expensive procedures, approve experimental treatments, and if something went wrong during surgery, she'd be positioned to collect on life insurance policies or file malpractice suits. "We need to call the police," Patricia said, her voice tight with anger. "This isn't just insurance fraud anymore. This is attempted murder." "Actually," a new voice said from the doorway, "we've been investigating this for weeks." Detective Sarah Williams entered the room, followed by a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Agent Martinez from the FBI's white-collar crime division. The irony of his name wasn't lost on me, but I was too focused on what they might know about the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my family.
Miss Martinez, I'm sorry we couldn't contact you sooner, but we needed to let this scheme play out far enough to gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. We've been monitoring Mrs. Chen's activities since her name appeared in connection with several similar fraud cases in other states. Agent Martinez consulted his notes. Helen Chen, whose real name is Helen Morrison, has been running variations of this scam for over 5 years. She targets elderly women living alone, befriends them to gather personal information, then uses accomplices to impersonate them for medical and insurance fraud. Morrison? The same last name as Janet, the woman lying in the hospital bed. The family connection made the conspiracy even more chilling. Janet is her daughter, Detective Williams confirmed. She's been the primary impersonator in at least 6 similar cases. They typically target women whose families are distant or estranged, making it less likely that the deception will be discovered quickly. I thought about all the conversations I'd had with Mrs. Chen, all the personal details I'd shared about my loneliness, my children's busy lives, my financial concerns. She'd been so sympathetic, so understanding about family dynamics that seemed to mirror her own situation, with children who visited regularly from out of state. "The children from Portland?" I asked. "Fictional," Agent Martinez replied, part of her cover story. She needed to appear normal, like a typical elderly woman with a loving family. It made her seem less threatening, more trustworthy. Robert was staring at the FBI agent with a mixture of fascination and horror. "How did you discover the fraud?" Insurance companies have sophisticated algorithms for detecting unusual billing patterns. When Eleanor Martinez suddenly developed multiple expensive conditions and began requiring frequent specialist care, it triggered automated fraud alerts. The timing was also suspicious, with all the medical activity beginning shortly after Mrs. Chen moved in next door. She'd moved in next door specifically to target me. The friendly neighbor who'd become my closest companion during my loneliest months had been a predator from the beginning, carefully cultivating a relationship that would give her access to everything she needed to steal my identity and exploit my isolation. "The surgical procedure scheduled for tomorrow," Dr. Hendricks asked. "What was it supposed to accomplish?" Detective Williams opened her own folder and pulled out several documents. According to the surgical consent forms, Eleanor Martinez was scheduled for experimental cardiac surgery with a high risk of complications. If the patient survived, the surgery would justify months of expensive recovery treatments.
If the patient didn't survive, Mrs. Chen, as healthcare proxy, would be positioned to file wrongful death suits and collect on insurance policies. The cold calculation behind the scheme was staggering. My life, or rather, Janet's life, while pretending to be me, was simply a variable in a financial equation. The surgical outcome didn't matter as long as it generated maximum profit for the conspirators. "There's something else you need to know," Agent Martinez said, looking directly at my children. "This scam specifically targets families where there's been a recent breakdown in communication. Mrs. Chen spent weeks studying your family dynamics before approaching your mother. She knew that you'd been distant, that you weren't visiting regularly, and that you'd be unlikely to notice changes in your mother's behavior during brief phone calls." The guilt that washed over Patricia's face was painful to watch. "You're saying this happened because we weren't good children? Because we were too busy for our mother?" "I'm saying that predators look for vulnerabilities they can exploit. In this case, the vulnerability was family isolation that made the fraud harder to detect." Maria was crying quietly, and I wanted to comfort her, but I also wanted her to understand the full weight of what had happened. My children's neglect hadn't caused this crime, but it had certainly made me an easier target. "How many other families has she destroyed?" I asked. "At least 12 that we know of. The victims were all elderly women living alone, all with families who had become distant for various reasons. The average loss per victim was over $100,000. And in 3 cases, the impersonators died during unnecessary medical procedures. 3 women had died because their families were too busy to notice that strangers were living their lives and making medical decisions that ultimately killed them. The scope of the tragedy went far beyond financial fraud." "What happens now?" Robert asked. "Now we arrest Mrs. Chen and charge her with multiple counts of identity theft, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and, in the cases where victims died, criminally negligent homicide. Janet will likely receive a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation in testifying against her mother." Janet looked up from the hospital bed with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about all of this."
I never wanted anyone to get hurt. But people did get hurt, I said quietly. 3 women died, and dozens of families were torn apart by this fraud. I understand you needed money for medical bills, but there are legal ways to get help. I know that now. I should have never listened to my mother. She said it was victimless, that we were just taking money from greedy insurance companies. She said the old women we were helping were lonely and neglected anyway, so at least they got some attention and medical care, even if it wasn't real. The twisted logic was almost harder to bear than the outright criminality. Mrs. Chen had convinced herself and her daughter that they were providing a service, giving lonely, elderly women the medical attention and care their own families wouldn't provide. "The attention wasn't real," Patricia said fiercely. "The friendship wasn't real. The care wasn't real. You were planning to let someone die on an operating table tomorrow morning just to steal money." Agent Martinez closed his folder and prepared to leave. "Mrs. Martinez, we'll need you to come to the federal building tomorrow to give a complete statement and identify evidence. Your insurance company will also want to meet with you about recovering the fraudulent payments." "What about my medical records?" I asked Dr. Hendricks. "How do we separate the real information from the fabricated history Janet created?" "We'll need to start over completely," he admitted. "Everything in your file from the past 6 months will need to be flagged as potentially fraudulent. You'll need comprehensive testing to establish your actual health status." The irony was that I'd now need to undergo the extensive medical evaluation that had been fabricated in my name. After months of someone else receiving medical care while impersonating me, I'd have to prove I was healthy enough not to need the treatments that had been prescribed for my fictional conditions. As the investigators prepared to leave, Detective Williams turned back to address my children. "I want you to understand something important. Your mother was specifically targeted because she appeared vulnerable and isolated. But she was also the one who uncovered this fraud by paying attention to details that didn't make sense. Her instincts and intelligence are what brought this conspiracy down." After everyone left except our family, we sat in the quiet hospital room processing everything we'd learned. Janet had been moved to a secure floor pending her arraignment,
and we were alone with the wreckage of trust that the fraud had created. "Mom," Patricia said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Did this happen because we weren't good children to you?" I looked at my daughter, this accomplished professional who'd built a successful career but had somehow lost track of the most important relationships in her life. It happened because criminals look for opportunities to exploit people's vulnerabilities. My vulnerability wasn't that I had bad children. It was that I was lonely and isolated, and someone took advantage of that. "But we made you lonely and isolated," Robert said quietly. "We created the vulnerability that made you a target." "Yes, you did. But that's a separate issue from the crime that was committed against me. We can address our family problems without taking responsibility for someone else's criminal behavior." Maria wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Mama, I want to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. When was the last time you felt like you mattered to us?" The question hit me harder than all the revelations about fraud and deception. When was the last time I'd felt like I mattered to my children? When had I last felt like anything more than an obligation they were avoiding? Honestly, it's been over a year, maybe longer.
I started feeling like I was bothering you every time I called, like I was interrupting something more important. So I stopped calling as much, and then you stopped calling entirely. "We never meant for you to feel that way," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Didn't you?" Because from where I was sitting, it felt very much like you meant exactly that. Like you were hoping I'd get the message and stop expecting attention from my adult children. The silence stretched between us, filled with months of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, we were all in the same room, having a real conversation about things that mattered. "I want to fix this," Maria said suddenly. "I want to fix our family before it's too late." "It's not too late," I said. "But it's going to take more than good intentions. It's going to take actual time and effort and prioritizing family relationships over career advancement." Robert nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that all night. About how quickly I dropped everything to fly here when I thought you were dying. About how I couldn't find an hour a week to call you when I thought you were fine." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You all have time for crisis management, but not for relationship maintenance. You'll rearrange your entire schedule for an emergency, but you can't manage a Sunday dinner once a month?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment, processing this observation. "You're right. We treated you like a responsibility instead of a relationship. We were managing our guilt about not visiting by convincing ourselves that you were fine and didn't really need us. But I did need you. I needed to feel connected to my family, to know that the people I'd raised and loved still cared enough to include me in their lives. Instead, I spent months feeling like I was dying of loneliness while strangers used my identity to create fake medical crises." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. While my children were too busy to notice my real emotional distress, criminals were fabricating medical emergencies in my name and profiting from fictional versions of the problems I was actually experiencing. "What do you want from us going forward?" Robert asked. "How do we rebuild this relationship?" I thought about that question, about what I really wanted from my children versus what I'd been willing to settle for during these months of neglect. I want regular contact that isn't about crisis management. I want to be included in your lives, not just contacted when you need something or when someone else thinks I'm dying. I want to feel like I matter to you when everything is going well, and not just when everything is falling apart. "That's fair," Maria said. "More than fair. We owe you that much and a lot more." "You don't owe me anything," I corrected. "Family relationships aren't debts to be paid. They're investments in the people we care about. And for the past year, none of you has been investing in our relationship." As dawn broke outside the hospital windows, painting the room in soft golden light,
I realized that Mrs. Chen's conspiracy had accomplished something she'd never intended. It had forced my family back together, created the crisis that made my children reevaluate their priorities, and given us the chance to address problems that had been festering for months. 3 hours ago, I'd been a lonely old woman whose children were too busy to return her phone calls. Now I was surrounded by those same children, having the most honest conversation we'd had in years about what family really means and what it takes to maintain relationships that matter. The fraud investigation would continue for months. There would be court appearances, insurance meetings, and the complicated process of rebuilding my legitimate medical records. Mrs. Chen would face justice for the crimes she'd committed against me and the other families she'd destroyed. But the most important work would happen in our own family, as we learned how to prioritize each other again and rebuild the trust that had been eroded by months of mutual neglect. It would take time, effort, and the kind of consistent attention that none of us had been willing to invest before this wake-up call. As we left the hospital together, walking out into the morning sunlight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope that the criminals would be punished or that my identity would be restored, but hope that my family could be restored too. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what really matters. Sometimes it takes nearly losing someone to realize how much you need them. And sometimes it takes strangers exploiting your family's weakness to show you how to become strong again. Mrs. Chen had targeted me because she thought I was vulnerable and alone. She was right about the vulnerable part, but wrong about the alone part. I had a family that loved me, even if they'd forgotten how to show it. And now that we'd all been reminded of what we meant to each other, no one would ever exploit that vulnerability again. The ambulance that had driven away from my house in the middle of the night had carried more than just a woman pretending to be me. It had carried away the illusion that family relationships can survive on good intentions alone, that love doesn't require time and attention, and that the people we care about will always be there waiting when we finally decide we're too busy anymore. In its place, it had left something much more valuable: the chance to rebuild our family on a foundation of genuine care, consistent attention, and the understanding that being busy is a choice, not a permanent condition, and that the most important appointments in our calendars should always be the ones with each other.
6 months later, I was sitting on my front porch with Patricia, watching her twin boys play in my yard while she helped me sort through old photo albums. It was a Sunday afternoon tradition we'd established after the fraud case was resolved, one of many changes that had transformed our family dynamics in ways I'd never imagined possible. The boys, Michael and David, were 12 now and had become regular fixtures at my house. They'd initially been resistant to the idea of spending Sunday afternoons with their grandmother, but they'd discovered that I had stories about their mother's childhood that she'd never shared with them, along with a well-stocked cookie jar and no restrictions on screen time during visits. "Mom, look at this one," Patricia said, holding up a photograph from her high school graduations. "I remember being so angry that day because you insisted on taking 1,000,000 pictures. I thought it was embarrassing." I examined the photo, remembering that day clearly.
Patricia in her cap and gown, trying to look sophisticated and adult, while I snapped photo after photo because I was so proud of my firstborn's achievement. "You said I was being ridiculous, that one picture would be enough." "I was an idiot," she laughed. "Now I take 1,000,000 pictures of the boys doing anything remotely noteworthy. Last week I took 47 photos of David making pancakes." The changes in Patricia had been the most dramatic of all my children. She'd reduced her hours at the marketing firm, delegating more responsibility to her team so she could maintain what she called family time boundaries. She'd also started therapy to address what she described as her addiction to being busy, recognizing that her constant state of urgency had been a way of avoiding deeper emotional connections. "I think I stayed so busy because it gave me an excuse not to think about the important stuff," she'd told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "If I was always rushing from one crisis to another, I never had to sit still long enough to realize how disconnected I'd become from the people I actually cared about." Robert had made different but equally significant changes. He'd negotiated with his tech company to work remotely 2 weeks out of every month, spending that time back home instead of in Seattle. He'd converted my spare bedroom into a home office, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine of morning coffee together before he started his workday and evening walks after he finished. "It's funny," he'd said just last week as we strolled through the neighborhood. "I spent all that time thinking I needed to be physically present at the office to be successful, but I'm actually more productive when I'm not constantly interrupted by meetings and office politics, and I'm definitely happier." The most surprising change had come from Maria. She'd always been the most emotionally available of my children, but she'd also been the most flighty, jumping from project to project without much stability. The fraud investigation had given her a sense of purpose she'd been missing. She'd started specializing in documentary photography focused on elder abuse and family reconciliation, using our story as the foundation for a project that had already helped 3 other families rebuild relationships that had been damaged by neglect or exploitation. "Mama, I got the call yesterday," she'd announced during her visit last Tuesday. "The gallery wants to feature my family reconciliation series as their spring exhibition. They're calling it Before It's Too Late." The irony wasn't lost on me that Mrs. Chen's criminal scheme had inadvertently launched my daughter's most meaningful career project. Maria had interviewed dozens of families who'd experienced similar crises, documenting both the damage that neglect could cause and the healing that was possible when people committed to rebuilding their relationships. Mrs. Chen herself had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, while Janet had received 5 years in exchange for her testimony. The legal proceedings had been lengthy and emotionally draining, requiring me to relive the isolation and manipulation I'd experienced. But they'd also provided a sense of closure and justice that helped me move forward. During the victim impact statements, I'd learned about the other families that had been destroyed by similar schemes. Mrs. Dorothy Phillips from Ohio, whose daughter lived in California and called once a month. Mrs. Helen Rodriguez from Texas, whose son was deployed overseas with the military. Mrs. Catherine Wong from Oregon, whose children were going through contentious divorces and had stopped visiting to avoid family drama. All of them had been targeted specifically because their families were distant or preoccupied. All of them had been elderly women living alone, hungry for connection, and vulnerable to someone who seemed genuinely interested in their lives. 3 of them had died during unnecessary medical procedures, their families devastated by guilt over the relationship failures that had made their mothers easy targets for exploitation. "The thing that haunts me most," Patricia had said after the sentencing hearing, "is how easily it could have been you. If we hadn't gotten lucky with the timing, if Mrs. Chen had been a little more careful with her planning, you could have died on that operating table while we were all too busy to even notice you were missing." The thought had haunted all of us. The realization that our family had come within hours of a tragedy that would have been entirely preventable if we'd simply maintained regular contact with each other had been a wake-up call none of us would ever forget. Dr. Hendricks had become something of a family friend during the process of rebuilding my medical records. The comprehensive health evaluation he'd ordered had revealed that I was actually in excellent health for a woman of my age, with none of the serious conditions that had been fabricated in Janet's impersonation visits. "You know, Eleanor, in all my years of practice, I've learned that the patients who do best are the ones with strong family support systems. Social isolation is actually a significant health risk factor for elderly patients. Your children's increased involvement in your life will probably add years to your lifespan." The insurance company had initially been skeptical about recovering the fraudulent payments, but the FBI's evidence was overwhelming. Every dollar of the $80,000 that had been stolen in my name was eventually recovered, plus punitive damages for the emotional distress the scheme had caused. I'd donated half of the settlement money to a nonprofit organization that provided support services for isolated elderly people, using Mrs. Chen's crime to fund programs that would prevent similar exploitation of vulnerable seniors. The other half had gone into college funds for Patricia's boys, an investment in the next generation of our family that felt like the right way to transform something negative into something hopeful. The most unexpected consequence of the entire ordeal had been the relationships I'd developed with other victims and their families. We'd formed an informal support group that met monthly, sharing strategies for family communication and warning signs of potential exploitation.
Some of the other victims had been less fortunate with their family reconciliations, but seeing our success had given them hope and motivation to keep trying. Mrs. Phillip's daughter had flown in from California for our first support group meeting and had ultimately decided to relocate closer to her mother. Mrs. Rodriguez's son had arranged for video calls twice a week from his military deployment and had his wife visit his mother regularly in his absence. Not every family had been able to rebuild completely, but all of them had made meaningful improvements in their relationships. You know what I realized? Robert had said during our last family dinner together. I spent all that time thinking I was supposed to be successful, meaning independent, not needing anyone else, not being a burden on other people.
But actually, being successful means being connected. It means having people who care about you and people you care about in return. The weekly family dinners had become sacred time for all of us. Every Sunday at 5 o'clock, we gathered around my dining room table, the same table where I'd served countless meals during their childhoods. We'd instituted a no-phones policy and a requirement that everyone share something meaningful from their week, not just work accomplishments, but personal reflections, challenges they were facing, or things they were grateful for. It's like we're learning how to be a family again, Maria had observed. We know how to be related to each other, but we'd forgotten how to actually relate to each other. The photo albums Patricia and I were sorting through contained the visual history of our family, from the children's baby pictures through their school years, graduations, and early adult achievements. But there was a noticeable gap in recent years, a period when we'd stopped documenting our time together because we'd stopped spending time together. We should take some new pictures today, Patricia suggested, closing the album we'd been examining. The boys have been here for 3 hours, and I haven't taken a single photo. That would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. We gathered the boys from the yard and arranged ourselves on the front porch steps, where Mrs. Chen and I had spent so many evenings together, where she'd gained my trust while planning my exploitation. It felt like reclaiming that space, filling it with genuine family love instead of calculated deception. As Patricia set up her phone camera with the timer function, I thought about how different this moment was from those lonely evenings when I'd sat here alone, wondering why my children had become strangers to me. Now I was surrounded by family members who'd learned to prioritize our relationships, who'd discovered that being busy was a choice rather than an unavoidable condition. Grandma Eleanor, Michael said as we positioned ourselves for the photo, Mom says you used to be really sad before we started coming to visit. Were you sad because of us? The question was heartbreaking in its directness, but also hopeful in its implication that he cared about my feelings. I was sad because I missed you all very much, but I'm not sad anymore because now I get to spend time with my favorite grandsons every week. You're our only grandsons, David pointed out with 12-year-old logic. That makes you my favorites by default, I replied, making them both laugh. The camera timer counted down and we smiled together, creating a new memory to add to the collection we were rebuilding. But more importantly, we were living in the moment instead of just documenting it, enjoying each other's company instead of rushing toward the next obligation. After Patricia and the boys left that evening, I sat on my front porch again, this time with a cup of tea and a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in years. The house next door, where Mrs. Chen had lived during her months of manipulation, now had new tenants, a young couple with a baby who waved to me every morning as they left for work. I'd been cautious about getting to know them at first, my trust in neighbors understandably shaken by the experience with Mrs. Chen, but they'd proven to be genuinely kind people who occasionally asked for small favors like accepting packages or watering plants when they traveled, normal neighborly interactions that didn't involve gathering personal information for criminal purposes. The evening air was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of families finishing dinner and children playing in nearby yards. It was the kind of evening I'd once spent feeling sorry for myself, dwelling on my children's absence and my own isolation. Now it felt like a gift, a quiet moment to reflect on how much had changed and how grateful I was for the hard-won lessons we'd all learned.
My phone rang, and I smiled when I saw Maria's name on the screen. It was Tuesday, which meant this was her regular check-in call, one of the many small commitments we'd all made to stay connected between our weekly dinners. "Hi, Mama. How was your day?" "Peaceful," I said, settling deeper into my porch chair. "Patricia and the boys came over this afternoon, and we looked through old photo albums. We took some new pictures, too." "I love that you're rebuilding the family photo collection. I've been thinking about putting together a scrapbook of all the pictures from our Sunday dinners. We have 6 months worth now." 6 months of consistent family time, of prioritizing each other, of choosing connection over convenience. It wasn't a long time in the grand scheme of life, but it felt significant because it represented a fundamental shift in how we related to each other. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. How was your day?" We talked for 20 minutes about her latest photography project, a family portrait session she'd done that afternoon, and her plans for the upcoming gallery exhibition. It was the kind of conversation we used to have regularly when she was younger, before career pressures and busy schedules had made us both feel like we didn't have time for simple connection. After we hung up, I remained on the porch for another hour, watching the neighborhood settle into evening routines and thinking about the strange journey that had brought our family back together. Mrs. Chen's conspiracy had nearly destroyed me financially and medically, but it had also revealed problems in our family that needed to be addressed. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show you what really matters. Sometimes it takes nearly losing someone to realize how much you need them. And sometimes it takes strangers exploiting your vulnerabilities to teach you how to become strong again. The fraud investigation was closed, the criminals were in prison, and my medical records had been restored to reflect my actual health status. But the most important recovery had been the restoration of my family relationships, the rediscovery of love that had always been there but had gotten buried under years of misplaced priorities and mutual neglect. As I finally went inside for the night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence that my children would be there for me if I needed them, not just in emergencies, but in the everyday moments that make up a life. And equally important, I knew that I would be there for them, that we'd learn to invest in our relationships during the good times instead of waiting for crises to bring us together. The ambulance that had driven away from my house 6 months ago had carried more than just a woman pretending to be me. It had carried away the illusion that family relationships could survive on autopilot, that love didn't require time and attention, and that being too busy was an acceptable excuse for neglecting the people who mattered most.
In its place, it had left something much more valuable: a family that had learned to prioritize each other, to invest in relationships before they broke down, and to understand that the most important work we do in life isn't in our offices or careers, but in the connections we maintain with the people we love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.